Pakistan's foreign minister recently said his country is facing a perfect storm of crises amid economic and political turmoil after devastating flooding and the return of the Taliban in neighboring Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands left the country last year, and the International Monetary Fund wants substantial reforms for a $6 billion bailout the country needs to avoid defaulting on its debts. With us for a closer look, we're joined in Karachi, Pakistan, by Umber Shamsi, journalist and director of the Center for Excellence in Journalism at the Institute of Business Administration. In Waterloo, Ontario, Mariam Mufti, associate professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and co-author of Pakistan's Political Parties, Surviving Between Dictatorship and Democracy. And finally, here in our studio, Sadia Malik, assistant professor of economics at York University, and we are delighted to have you back here on our program, and to our guests in Points Beyond. Thank you for joining us as well. Let's just do a little fact file off the top here and bring our listeners and viewers up to scratch on a bit of Pakistani history. Key historical dates, and Sheldon, I'll ask you to bring this graphic up. We start in 1947, where the Muslim state of East and West Pakistan were created out of the partition of India at the end of British rule. Less than a decade later, Pakistan becomes the world's first Islamic republic. In 1971, East Pakistan attempts to secede, leading to civil war. India intervenes in support of East Pakistan, which eventually breaks away to become Bangladesh. In 1999, Army Chief Pervez Musharraf, who actually died just a couple of months ago, incidentally, seizes power in a coup, ousting Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. In 2007, former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto is assassinated while on a campaign trail for the next year's parliamentary elections. And then in 2018, former international cricket star Imran Khan becomes prime minister on a pledge to end corruption and dynastic politics, but he loses power 4 years later. Let's continue by taking a look at a map of the region. We are talking about the world's fifth most populous country. 243 million people living in Pakistan, bordered by India to the east, Afghanistan to the west, Iran to the southwest, China to the northeast. The capital is Islamabad, and Umber is joining us from its largest city, which is Karachi. And let's start there. I'd like you, if you would, Umber, to take us back to April of last year. 1 minute, Imran Khan, the very charismatic and very famous Prime Minister of Pakistan, is in office, and then he becomes the first Prime Minister to be removed from office through a no-confidence vote. Sheldon, bring up a picture so we can see the two people at the center of this. There's former Prime Minister Khan on the left, the current Prime Minister Sharif on the right. Umber, tell us, what happened?
I'm going to try and simplify this because I find that Pakistani politics is usually difficult to explain. Simply, Imran Khan, who came to power and who was elected in 2018 with the support of the military establishment at that time, fell afoul and lost some of the support that he used to get just in terms of, running his government. And he's admitted that in several interviews that he's given to various TV channels and digital news platforms. But what happened in April 2022 was that the opposition parties, you just saw Shahbaz Sharif, who is the Prime Minister and the President of the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, one of the parties that represents old Pakistan, dynastic politics. His brother was Prime Minister. He was Chief Minister of Pakistan's biggest province. Nawaz Sharif's daughter, or the current Prime Minister's chief, niece, actually, Mariam Nawaz, is campaigning for elections in the country at the moment. So, there's a dynasty at play here. The other party that was a part of this movement to remove Imran Khan was the Pakistan People's Party. You spoke about the foreign minister, that's Bilawal Bhutto Zardari. He comes from a long line of ex-prime ministers who, I may add, also ran afoul of the military establishment and found themselves out of power. His grandfather, actually, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, was hanged. So these parties that represented older Pakistan dynastic politics, they had been in opposition. Imran Khan said that they were corrupt. Several cases were opened up against them. Most of these leaders had been in and out of jail. They saw an opportunity in April. They had been planning this for a while. They saw that Imran Khan had lost the support within the military establishment, the then Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa, and they made a move. Essentially using a constitutional means for the first time to remove a prime minister, which is a vote of no confidence, which is essentially the House saying, well, Prime Minister, we don't want you as a leader of the House anymore. Since then, what's happened, obviously, Imran Khan refused to take this lying down, and has used various tactics and strategies. His one demand has been called for elections. Now, interestingly, Imran Khan's popularity graph had fallen while he was in power. But since then, it has skyrocketed massively on the basis of several sort of key slogans that Imran Khan has used. Corruption has been one of them. He's also used religion whenever he's needed to. He's tapped into a deep vein of anti-Americanism, and had claimed that the Americans were involved in the conspiracy to have him removed as prime minister. He's also tried to mend fences and get back some of his, let's say, PR within the U.S. as well, by hiring a PR firm, a lobbying firm. But, his tactics that he's used, these are some of the slogans, these are some of the sort of narratives that he's built since he's been removed from power. He's also massively named and shamed the army establishment, which has typically been behind many prime ministers who've lost their seats, and has come afoul of them just like the other prime ministers. I think the interesting thing is that some of his tactics have been, for instance, long marches. He's held 2 long marches. He's tried to dissolve 2 provincial assemblies, as well, in which he was in power. These are all in order to trigger elections. But I think most crucially is the fact that he's constantly been on the streets, and there's been an assassination attempt against him as well. There have been several cases filed against him, just as the opposition leaders that I was talking about. There were several cases filed against him. Imran Khan now has dozens of cases against him, most of them clearly politically motivated. Many of his leaders have been jailed, or there've been claims of custodial torture as well. Many journalists who have support, and I know it's kind of ironic when we say that journalists supporting a political party, but in this kind of polarized atmosphere, as you see in the U.S., there are obviously clear lines drawn within the media as well. So many journalists or many commentators who have supported Imran Khan have found themselves, the legal cases against him. So it feels a little like the names. At the top, for instance, Imran Khan has been replaced. The face has changed. It has been replaced with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, but the attacks on a certain kind of political ideology or party associated with the party, those attacks have continued. And at the same time, I would say that Parliament, which is meant to be, the most powerful institution in Pakistan, never has been, and now is also half empty because Imran Khan's members of parliament had resigned.
Okay, let me jump in there if I can.
Well.
And I'm going to get Marin to pick up the story from there, which is to say this is yet another example of another leader in Pakistan who has been unable to fulfill a 5-year term. I think if I'm right about this, I'm not sure any leader in Pakistan's history has been able to serve a full 5-year term. Why not?
So as Amber alluded, the military establishment in Pakistan has a very significant role to play in politics. And Pakistan's 75-year-long history has basically been a never-ending tussle between the military establishment and the political elite. Now, the military establishment has tried to undermine the political elite in Pakistan using state institutions such as the judiciary and the bureaucracy to uplift the authority and the power of the executive through the office of the president instead of the office of an elected prime minister. The other thing we know about the military, of course, is that has been in direct control of Pakistan's politics for almost 33 years of its existence by carrying out military coups. So these two factors aside, the role of the military establishment, the third factor really is that these political elites don't really do much favor to themselves. They are corrupt. Amber has talked about their dynasticism and the fact that they're unwilling Democrats. They have not necessarily brought about democratic governance in the country either, or tried to establish themselves and establish their supremacy over the military in the country. The last thing that I would like to say about this is that there has been a constitutional amendment, the 8th Amendment, that has given the president authority to remove a sitting elected prime minister minister from power. And this constitutional amendment has been in Pakistan's constitutions from 1985 to almost 2010. And during that time period, we saw 5 prime ministers being removed from office. So these 3 factors really explain what has been going on in Pakistan and why prime ministers are so powerless, so to speak.
Understood. Sadia, you teach economics, so let's focus on that. We mentioned off the top the IMF is considering a $6 billion loan to Pakistan because the economy is in such trouble right now.
Yeah.
What's gone wrong?
Okay, so the economic crisis in Pakistan is quite acute. It's probably one of the worst of its kind in the history of about 75 years of country's existence. This is manifested by an extremely large, actually alarmingly large external debt. So over the next 5 years, Pakistan owes close to $30 billion each year to various multilateral as well as bilateral international donors.
30 billion
$30
a year.
billion a year. And it has a trade deficit of about $20 billion. And the foreign exchange reserves at the moment sit at only about $3 to $5 billion, down from about $17 billion last year. So this is quite an alarming situation for Pakistan. The currency, which is Pakistani rupee, has weakened dramatically over the past couple of months. The inflation is all-time high, 30% overall, and 40% food inflation. And this has given rise to a lot of food insecurity and rise in the poverty levels in Pakistan.
Let me do a follow-up with you on the flooding. We all
Yeah.
heard about the
Yeah.
terrible floods that took so many lives over there. How has that contributed to the economic instability?
It has contributed massively. The economic cost of flooding, as estimated by the World Bank study, is about $15 billion, which is twice the amount that Pakistan owes to International Monetary Fund. The human cost of this flooding have been massive. They've affected about 33 million people, which is close to the total population in Canada. It has destroyed about 60 to 80% of the crops in Pakistan, leading to a lot of food inflation. The livelihoods of people associated with agriculture have been affected a lot as well. Yeah.
Is this a country that is impossible to govern, given its current conditions?
It is, I wouldn't say it is impossible to govern, but it is difficult to govern. And I think the country has to, and as well as its economic and political managers, have to make like tough choices right now to put the country back to the path of economic growth.
Okay, well, I'm going to go to Mariam on that as well. Because, like, Canada is difficult to govern. Is Pakistan impossible to govern? Because surely it's got to be harder to govern Pakistan right now than it is Canada.
I wouldn't say impossible, but I will say that it is one of the toughest countries in the world to govern and extremely complicated. And to me, this is completely unsurprising. To govern 243 million people who are ethnically and linguistically diverse, and not to mention Pakistan's geopolitical context, where the country, on the one hand, is trying to maintain parity with its much larger neighbor, India, and also being extremely important to the United States' national security interests means that Pakistan has become incredibly aid dependent. That has prevented Pakistan's political leaders from establishing sustainable economic institutions that, to a certain extent, speak to what Sadia is talking about, the current economic crisis in the country. And the last thing I would definitely say, add to this the challenges of development, add to this a burgeoning population of young people with aspirations, and then a political elite and a military establishment that is not necessarily willing to allow democracy to flourish in the country. Yes, it is a very, very difficult country to govern, and it's facing challenges in many different sectors. Its national security, threats to its security from terrorists, and then, of course, internal domestic problems, as we've been talking about.
Well, to the end of trying to be a good democratic country, Umber, I'll ask you to pick up the story there, because a thriving journalistic sector is necessary to make that happen, and that's where you come in. And yet, we find out from Reporters Without Borders, the World Press Freedom Index, which assesses the state of journalism in 180 countries and territories around the world, and out of 180, Pakistan ranks 157, which doesn't sound too good. So I wonder how concerned are you about your safety, and how hard is it for you to do your job?
Thank you. I think I'm concerned about my safety because I've seen friends and colleagues who have been attacked, who have been picked up, who have been killed. One journalist who was murdered last year, I worked with him for a few years at one channel, Arshad Sharif. He was killed in another country, in Kenya.
Do we know by whom?
Investigation. No, we don't know we don't know yet. There have been fact-finding missions from state representatives as well as independent media organizations. There have been whispers and rumors. There was a case that was opened up. We don't know. Similarly, there are other colleagues and friends of mine who were, whose houses house was broken into. He was a former producer of mine, actually, and he was attacked. Another former colleague of mine was picked up for a day. We made a lot of fuss on social media. I lost my job as a result of many of the attacks, and I lost my job during Imran Khan's time. What I'm trying to say is that it really does feel as if the tactics haven't changed. The current government used to criticize Imran Khan, and rightfully so, on his democratic credentials as well as freedom of express, because we saw a great slide in Pakistan's press freedom index during Imran Khan's time. But none of this has been corrected, which points to the same problem. If the problem isn't the civilian government, the problem has to be the military elite or the military establishment, which perhaps is continuing those same tactics. I think I've been a journalist for over 20 years, and I think the slide I have felt noticeably. I still vividly remember in 2018 when we were covering the elections and we were told not to talk about rigging. I specifically remember many movements in the periphery, dissenting voices that we wanted to include in our TV mainstream shows, and we were specifically instructed not to do so.
Instructed specifically by whom?
Well, I mean, it doesn't work as clearly as it does in other countries, but there would be a phone call that we would get from somebody powerful who would call the owner of the channel or the news editor, and we were told not to do those stories. Or more directly through the regulatory authority, which is called Pakistan Electronic Media Regulatory Authority. So many interviews were pulled off, and now we see similarly where Imran Khan has obviously been very openly naming military generals, for instance, and the regulatory authority has stopped a live airing of his speeches. It stopped covering protests. I'm not saying that he doesn't get any coverage at all, but I just do feel that there seems to be clearly an attempt to at least control him. And I think it's interesting because Imran Khan is seen partly as a product. The ecosystem was very similar, same kind of voter bank. There's also a lot of support behind the scenes from, factions within the military for Imran Khan. And now he's also, in a sense, the army establishment's nemesis. And I think that is a development that is partially new in Pakistan. Many political leaders have struggled and have tried to assert civilian supremacy. I would disagree with Mariam there, because there have been assertions of civilian supremacy in different ways. But I do think that this is different because Imran Khan, being the kind of populist, disruptive leader that he is, has gone much further than the others did, who tried to remain within the system.
Okay, let me jump in and give Mariam a chance to respond to that if we have a bit of a disagreement here, which we love on this program. Civil disagreement is all about democracy. So go ahead, Mariam, over to you.
Right. No, I don't disagree with Amber. There have been attempts at trying to assert civilian supremacy, but at the same time, you have to agree that these very same civilian politicians also tend to change their political allegiances, and they tend to switch political parties and tend to jump in on the political party that is likely to have the support of the military in order to establish itself in power. I mean, currently, if you just take Imran Khan, I mean, one of his allies in the Punjab government is Chief Minister Pervez Elahi, who has in the past been a partner of the military establishment as well, right? So I agree with Amber. There have been assertions. I'm not saying that all politicians have been completely unwilling to establish their supremacy over the military. But then at the same time, if you start digging deeper into their political allegiances, where these individuals came from, who groomed them, and very often when they've partnered with the military, you start to see that they might be what I term unwilling Democrats.
Well, while you have the floor, let me follow up on that because I don't have to tell you, I suppose, half the people sleepwalk through elections in Ontario and in Canada, and that doesn't certainly seem to be the case in Pakistan, where you've got provincial elections coming up and a general election later this year as well. What role do you think all of that is playing in the political chaos the country is facing right now?
Right. So for the viewers who are listening in, I mean, the similarity between Canada and Pakistan is striking, right? Pakistan is also a federal parliamentary institutional structure. We also have a first-past-the-post electoral system. However, that's where the similarities end. Provincial and federal elections in Pakistan have typically occurred on the same day. And so, in a sense, we haven't been able to separate the results of the provincial elections and the federal elections. However, what's happening this year is that provincial elections will be held in Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. Now, Punjab is a province that has typically been the stronghold of the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz group, led by our current Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif right now. And Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province is the stronghold of the opposition, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, led by Imran Khan. Now, both political parties, the government and the opposition political parties, are clamoring to win the provincial election, because the provincial election, who wins the provincial election is likely also to sweep the federal election. And I think the idea is that by undermining each other's opponents, they could potentially tilt the electoral playing field in their favor moving forward. And this is certainly adding to the political chaos that is currently brewing in the country. Amber mentioned cases against Imran Khan, for example. I mean, that is just one way to try and lessen his support base in the country. Of course, that's not happening because Amber also mentioned that the political graph is, his popularity seems to be on an up tilt.
Sadia, we talked a moment ago about all the economic problems the country is facing. If there were to be an economic recovery in Pakistan, what would it look like?
Well, I think Pakistan badly needs fundamental economic reforms at this time. So far, the country has been following what I would call a debt-financed consumption model, whereby it relied a lot on external borrowing to pay for its imports. With a very weak export base and with very little foreign direct investment that the country has been able to attract over the period of time, the country has relied a lot on foreign borrowing. So now is the time to come up with a good industrialization strategy that would help the country to reduce its reliance on imports, incentivize the export-oriented industries, and attract foreign direct investment. So it is time for the economic managers of the country to make some tough choices and do some tough conversations around a number of areas. Taxation system is one example. The domestic revenue capacity of Pakistan is extremely weak, as indicated by the tax to GDP ratio of about 5% of its GDP.
Does that mean people are not paying their taxes?
Yeah.
That's what it means.
So that means that a lot of sectors are outside the tax net. For example, capital gains is not taxed in Pakistan. The real estate sector is not utilized for its potential in contributing to the tax revenue.
You say the country needs an industrialization policy.
Yeah.
What does Pakistan make that the rest of the world might want?
I think Pakistan makes good textile products. It makes surgical instruments. It makes sports goods. And many other goods that Pakistan need to explore and invest in. So I think taxation system needs to be reformed. And investment in human capital is extremely important because the productivity is extremely low in Pakistan. So it needs to invest in its population. Health and education is the key. And I know as an economist that a country's productivity really depends on the productivity of the people that eventually determines our standard of living.
Sure. Now, we mentioned off the top the IMF is at the center of so much of this, and there's another loan that Pakistan wants from the IMF right now. But I gather it has received, 23 loans to date and is still on the verge of default.
Yeah.
So what is the usefulness of all of this?
Yeah, that raises important questions about the usefulness of the effectiveness of IMF, as well as the countries participating the policies of the countries participating in those programs. So just for the sake of your viewers' information, International Monetary Fund helps countries in economic crisis by providing them some concessional loans, as well as technical support in the form of reform package that can address their economic crisis. Now, the reform package that they propose has often been criticized as being too standard, like one-size-fits-all kind of an approach that consists of some like fiscal austerity measures, like cut down on government spending, raise more taxes, and some market-oriented reforms like privatization, etc. Now, these are good reforms that look good on paper and theory, but in countries like Pakistan that has poor political and economic institutions, these reforms may not deliver the right kind of results because they are not implemented in their full spirit. For example, the prescription of raising the tax revenues, it's often implemented by countries like Pakistan as relying more on indirect taxes, with the burden of which falls on the middle income and the poor income groups. Likewise, when the IMF prescribes countries to sort of cut down on government spending, then in an effort to introduce fiscal austerity, these countries often cut down on spending on health, education, and social security. Privatization process is also not very transparent. So that is one reason why IMF reforms do not deliver the results as anticipated. Because when the countries are in economic crisis, what they need is fundamental economic reforms, right?
You need political stability to do that.
You need political stability, fundamental reforms, and and I don't blame IMF for that, because those kinds of reforms should originate from within the country than from an external financial institution.
Mariam, I want to ask you about the diaspora here in Canada, and I wonder if you could tell us what kind of impact the ongoing instability in Pakistan is having on the community here in Canada.
Right. So Pakistan contributes to about 215,000 Pakistani Canadians of Pakistani origin. It is the fifth largest source of permanent residents in Canada. So it's a substantial diaspora. To what extent are they impacted by the political crisis in Pakistan? Now, this is an important question because what we've seen happen in the past is that whenever there's been instability amongst the Sikh community in India, the Sikh diaspora has had something to say about it. The Sri Lankan civil war also resulted in the Tamils protesting, the Tamil population, Tamil diaspora in Canada protesting against what was happening in Sri Lanka. We don't see that happen with the Pakistani diaspora in Canada. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the Pakistani diaspora in Canada is not necessarily as connected politically and as inclined to participate in politics and influence foreign policy in Canada in much the same way. Now, is the diaspora being impacted? It certainly is. You see, this diaspora still continues to hold business assets and other personal assets back home in Pakistan. And as the Pakistan rupee is depreciating, a lot of this asset and a lot of this wealth is also starting to decline for the Pakistani diasporic citizens. So the economic costs, yes, are being felt by the Pakistani diaspora in Canada. The other thing I will say is that many Pakistani diaspora families are sending money in the form of remittances back home to Pakistan to help some of their family members in Pakistan during this economic crisis. It's a cost of living crisis now, isn't it? There's skyrocketing inflation in Pakistan, and Sadia would attest to the 27% unprecedented inflation rate in Pakistan. So I believe that the Pakistani diaspora is getting impacted in that way as well. And lastly, I will say, and anecdotally, and Amber could probably speak to this a little bit more as well, is that overseas Pakistanis typically tend to support the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, and that would mean support for Prime Minister Imran Khan. And so I believe if there is going to be any impact that we see on the lives of these individuals is them making financial contributions to Imran Khan's campaign, them participating in elections to the extent that they still are on the electoral registries in Pakistan.
Quick word on that?
Yeah, while Mariam was talking about the role of diaspora, I would say a little bit about the role of international community, particularly Canada, in helping Pakistan address its economic crisis. So I think that, first of all, we need support from international community to help support continued democracy and constitutional rule in Pakistan, because that would set the incentive structure right for the policymakers to be able to make the right kinds of decisions, right? We need to set the incentive structures right, so that the policymakers are guided by institutions that encourage good decision making and penalizes bad decision making. So I think that is important. Secondly, I think Canada can contribute in sort of sitting down with the international as well as by multilateral and bilateral donors, and come up with a sort of debt restructuring plan that Pakistan so badly needs at the moment. And my recommendation is to link it to climate change. So given that Pakistan experienced one of the worst climate catastrophe in this century, and the economic costs have been huge, and we also know that Pakistan contributes a very minuscule amount of its carbon footprint in terms of carbon emissions. So it is only fair that the international community offers some sort of maybe debt for climate swaps is my idea, where Pakistan's debt is at least partially written off in exchange for sort of a commitment to put in place climate resilient systems.
Gotcha. I've got a minute left here. Amber, I wonder if I could ask you, we talk about outside influences in Pakistan. I note that Saudi Arabia and China are helping out to the tune of multiple billions of dollars, and I wonder what you think they expect for their money.
Well, I think at the moment Pakistan has constantly gone to what it calls its friends. It's deep friendship and loyalty to China, as well as long-standing friendship with Saudi Arabia, to paper over those much-needed reforms that don't happen, economic reforms that don't happen, and then we constantly go to the IMF and other friendly countries for more money. Actually, I think things have changed. Saudi Arabia isn't giving us money. It's not giving us an easy loan or easy rollover for debt. China, we owe a lot of money to China because of the BRI and as well as CPEC, which is the Chinese infrastructure projects within Pakistan. And they're not helping us either. So while they may be small sort of loans that are rolled over, broadly, we still owe these countries money, and they're not helping us out simply because Pakistan has not, obviously, successive governments have not done the kind of hard work of economic reform that really needed to be done, which is why we keep going back to the IMF and asking for more money and more aid.
That sums it up nicely. I want to thank you three for joining us on TVO tonight and helping us understand this part of the world much better. Much appreciated.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.